Beginning of the end of the Cold War. So really, once you're looking at the late 80s, historians generally agree that the Soviet Union's really muddling along at that point and isn't really executing some sort of well-planned global strategy and like military expansion like you saw back in the 70s. This is partly due to just an aging Soviet leadership, but a lot of it is due to economic weakness. We saw back in like the 70s, for instance, the Soviet Union is going to support Marxist regimes in like Angola, Ethiopia, Nicaragua, Afghanistan. But that's not really as much the case by the time you get to the late 80s. Reagan's administration, for instance, is going to really reemphasize Central Europe as the focus of this rivalry between the United States and the Soviet Union. For instance, America is going to place cruise missiles and mid-range Pershing II missiles in Europe in 1983. Now, the thing is, NATO governments approve of this, but it does frighten a lot of citizens within Europe because a lot of them are going to really see the United States as being kind of a dangerous and aggressive force when you're looking at world affairs and like the Cold War and everything. But there's also an element of all of this, and this specific movement is showing that the United States was serious about nuclear war. And our defense program shows this as well. In fact, the United States started working on ways to survive if nuclear war actually came to be. The thing is, the escalation, I should make note of the nuclear arms race is going to reinvigorate anti-war as well as anti-nuclear movements in the United States as well as Europe. And in fact, the anti-war and anti-nuclear forces are going to gain a lot more traction when it comes out that scientists will start arguing that the smoke and dust thrown up by an atomic war would devastate the entire ecology of the globe and basically trigger a nuclear winter. In fact, if you go back in like world history, this has happened to a certain extent in the world. There's, for instance, the extinction of like the dinosaurs and everything is argued that yes, an asteroid probably hit the Earth, but what killed a lot of the dinosaurs with all the dust and debris coming up and basically blocking out the sun, and then you get a cooling of the Earth and how that affects, and et cetera, et cetera. So basically it's that same principle. So we're seeing things like nuclear freeze rallies and such. So to combat this, we're going to get Reagan announcing the Strategic Defense Initiative, or the SDI, although this was also known as the Star Wars program in 1983. Basically, it was about deploying new defenses that could like intercept and destroy ballistic missiles as they rose from the ground and arced through space. There was all kinds of ideas put forward about like ripping missiles to shreds before they even hit their targets, things like that. The problem is all of these were untested, and some of them only really existed in people's imaginations. Very few scientists actually thought like SDI could work. So that's kind of where we're at in the arms race. During Reagan's time as president, we're also going to get the so-called Reagan Doctrine. Basically, this was concerning itself over Soviet-influenced governments in places like Asia, Africa, and Latin America. And the idea of the Reagan Doctrine was that America needed to eliminate these Soviet-influenced governments if the United States wanted to win the Cold War. That being said, this could be seen as a very aggressive policy, but actually Reagan's administration is going to manage to keep the United States out of major war. Generally, they would back off in the face of serious trouble, and yet they achieved some big symbolic victories. It's things like the United States troops would invade the Caribbean island of Grenada in October of 1983, and there they would rescue medical students and put in a much more sympathetic and locally popular government in power. In fact, when looking at Central America specifically, Reagan's administration is going to blame Soviet Union influence for all of the political turmoil going on in Central America. A lot of times they're going to specifically blame Soviet-backed Cuba. So we're going to see from like 1980 to 1983-ish, a lot of times the United States sends military aid to conservative governments. The United States also is going to engage in like espionage in a lot of these governments, like using the CIA or the NSC, and you have these direct covert operations. One of the big targets during this time period is specifically looking at Nicaragua. Basically, America didn't want Nicaragua to be Cuba all over again, and so they would end up helping leftist insurgents also in like El Salvador. When looking at the Middle East, really intervention there is generally by most historians considered a failure during the 80s. In 1982, Israel, which you can see pictured here, it's very small near the Mediterranean Sea and everything there, invaded Lebanon, the small country to its north, and that's in that's blue area there. The thing is, Lebanon was already bogged down at that point with the civil war between Christian Arabs and Muslims, and now they're having to fight Israel on top of that. So Reagan is actually going to end up sending United States troops to preserve the Lebanese state, basically on a so-called presence mission. However, this actually angered a lot of the Arabs in Lebanon, and it motivated a lot of like terrorist actions against Israel and the United States, especially by Islamic radicals. When I talk about these terrorist actions, it'll be things like in October of '83, you get a terrorist car bomb that kills 241 American Marines in their barracks. And the thing is, soon after this, Americans are basically going to pull back out. But this left the impression that Americans were basically short of breath, so to speak, when it came to disagreements in the Middle East and dealing with Middle Eastern politics. And so this actually ends up undermining United States-backed peace initiatives in the Middle East. That being said as well, you get a continuation of terrorist attacks against Americans during this time period in the Middle East, and even like taking Americans hostage. It could be anything from like bombing cruise ships and sabotaging airliners, basically all aimed at going against America and the fact that America was supporting Israel on some level. And this is going to bring us to the big issue that happens during Reagan's term, and it is known as the Iran-Contra affair. Basically, Reagan's administration sold weapons secretly to Iran, and in return they were supposed to get help basically from Iran in securing the release of like American-held hostages. Here's the thing, the last time we looked at Iran in this class was the Iran hostage crisis. So America really wasn't on great terms with Iran and was not supposed to be selling them weapons. They did sell like anti-tank missiles specifically to Iran because Iran at this time is basically at war with Iraq. As a result of the sale of these armaments and everything, we are going to see some pro-Iranian radicals releasing several American hostages, but a lot of times they would just take new hostages as well. Now, all of these deals, illegal deals, came to light in 1986, and you get congressional hearings in the summer of '87. And it turns out the United States actually had a double evasion of the law because they had funneled millions of dollars from those armament sales specifically to Nicaraguan Contras. A lot of this is, undermining that whole self-determination in different nations and so on and so forth. Specifically, this is breaking the Boland Amendment, though it depends on one's interpretation of some of that. Anyway, we have two big problems here. One, America sold armaments unlawfully. And second of all, there was an effort to then cover up the illegal and unconstitutional actions. Both the President Reagan and Vice President Bush were very much aware of what had gone on and participated in efforts in withholding information and misleading Congress, but they basically ride out the whole affair, and those two get away with not much consequences, so to speak. When it comes to American policy in Asia during the 80s, though, it's a bit refreshing because it's a bit different. We see a lot of the same ideas, but a lot more successful. American diplomats, for instance, would push out the corrupt President Ferdinand Marcos from the Philippines. This opened up the way for a popular uprising who put Corazon Aquino in office, who very much supports the United States much more. We also see, like in South Korea, the United States would also help ease out an unpopular dictator and support democratic elections that brings about a much more popular and pro-American government. So, looking at the entire Cold War, which, yes, I know that is a lot of time period, what is a one-sentence summary of the Cold War up to this point?